A lot of you, this is your first time to Ratio Christi, so just kind of a quick introduction to who we are. We like to have discussions on some of the questions of life, the claims of Christianity, who Jesus is, who God is, questions about the Bible. And then we also like to engage with other worldviews and other ways of thinking. So tonight we have with us a guest speaker to talk about Islam. James Rayment will be with us tonight. He's done a lot of work to understand and have good conversations with Muslims, and he also is the founder and director of the Maidah Initiative, which helps train Christians in how to have good conversations. So.
Thank you. So I actually used to work for Crew on UW, so it's actually like really trippy to be back. But it's been like 4 years since I've been on campus, so it's really weird. So it's like I was gone probably right before most of you got here, and then had to leave again, obviously. I'll try and get right into it. So, as I said, my name is James. I'm originally from England, and like many of you, I grew up in the shadow of 9/11. So who here actually remembers 9/11? Okay, some of you. This is crazy. We're getting to the point where some people don't. I was 11 years old when 9/11 happened, and I was walking back from my school, and my friend Joe's mother comes out of her house crying because one of the World Trade Center towers had been hit. And if I'm remembering it right, this was while the first one had hit. So everyone just kind of like assumed it was like some tragic accident to start with, and then suddenly the second plane hits, and the world changed forever at that point. And then Osama bin Laden's face is plastered everywhere. And honestly, at this point in my life, it was kind of neat to have an interesting bad guy. Because I grew up in the shadow of both my grandfathers who fought in the Second World War, and Hitler was taking over Europe, and both my grandfathers joined the Air Force, and our civilization fought the Nazis, and everything since then kind of felt mundane, right? And that's why we refer to that generation as the greatest generation, because everything since then has been somewhat less impressive. So this 11-year-old me is like, all right, finally, an interesting villain in the story. But and then when I turned 13, Islam switched from, started taking Christianity seriously, and Islam switched from sort of geopolitical villain to theological villain. But I didn't necessarily have an in-depth understanding of Islam. I didn't know any Muslims. But over the next few years, I'd read some things over the internet. And then when I was 19, I was 20. So I had a college project to do where I had to sort of make a radio documentary that was an interview show. So I interviewed people about their views on the end of the world. So first I found some Mormon missionaries and talked to them, found someone from my church, and then I thought, what else would be interesting? A Muslim perspective would be interested on this. I don't know any Muslims though, so I looked around my hometown in England, and I looked into the T-Mobile store, and there was a woman in a hijab in there, like the headscarf. So I said, hey, are you Muslim? She's like, yeah. It's like, hey, can I interview you on your views on the end of the world? She says, sure, but you have to finish my shift first. And so we got Subway, we talked, and then I got invited to her birthday, actually, and met her sisters and her family. And at that point, I decided that I should read the Quran for myself. So I did, and I basically blocked out 3 days in a coffee shop to kind of like power through it. So what you'll learn about the Quran pretty quickly is that it's actually only considered the Quran in Arabic. So the English Quran is not considered the Quran. It's called a translation of the meaning of the Quran. So for Muslims, they don't consider themselves to be reading the Quran if they're reading it in a language other than Arabic. So there's also no narrative to the Quran. So what I grew up hearing is that the Quran was like Muhammad's running commentary on the Old Testament, and that's just not true. There's no narrative to the Quran. It's all kind of prose poetry ordered from longest to shortest. And then at the time of Muhammad, it actually only existed as an oral document. It wasn't written down during his lifetime. So the Quran is about 77,000 words long, and that's slightly shorter than the 4 Gospels put together. So I think a lot of people are scared of the Quran because they see it seems like this gigantic, unmanageable book, but it's actually pretty short. It's not difficult, at least as far as length read. And that means it's a third the length of the New Testament, and about 10% the length of the entire Bible. So, again, not a huge task to read. And some of the themes of the Quran is, firstly, is the theme of monotheism versus polytheism. And they worship besides Allah things that harm them not, nor profit them, and they say, these are instances with Allah, say, do you inform Allah of that which He knows not in the heavens and on the earth? Glorified and exalted above He is all that they associate with as partners with Him. So the next theme is the idea of the Prophet Muhammad. This idea that he is the seal of the prophets, which means the idea is they're taking a letter, putting wax on it and sealing it. So nothing more for the prophets to say. Muhammad is the last prophet. And then we also have this idea of the scales of judgment. The idea that on the day you die, you stand before God, your good deeds will be weighed against your bad deeds, and that is the difference between heaven or hell. I actually made this scales of judgment because I couldn't find a good picture. I ordered the scales from Amazon, found this on a plastic Quran, and these things here are like fish tank filler. And the more of the Islamic sources you read, the more complicated the conception of judgment becomes. But that is the sort of pressing theme in the Quran. And then another thing that surprised me as I was reading through the Quran is we have this theme of the people of the book. So in Surah Al-Maidah, let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah hath revealed therein. If any do fail to judge by the light of what Allah has revealed, they are no better than those who rebel. And then Surah Al-Maidah, verse 68 says, say, O people of the book, you have no ground to stand upon unless you stand fast by the law, the gospel, and all the revelation that has come to you from your Lord. So, Al-Maidah Initiative, see what we did there? So, I thought this would be easy. The Quran tells Muslims that they should trust the Bible and has respect for the Bible. I'll show Muslims this verse, then they'll be like, oh yeah, I should read the Bible. But that is not how it went down at all. And I couldn't really figure out why. So, that fell off my radar for a little bit. But then I moved to Seattle in 2011, and I decided that after completing the kind of initial internship, I was working for a company called Subsplash, had a lot of time to listen to audio while I was working, and decided that I would use that time to listen to the Book of Mormon first of all, because I'd run into those guys a lot and wanted a better answer than, I read about you guys on Wikipedia and watched South Park. I wanted to actually I actually wanted to study it myself and read it firsthand rather than just assuming things about it. And once I was done with that, I decided I'd jump into the Islamic source material. So in addition, so what you kind of learn about, there's kind of, the first thing I listened to was something called Sahih al-Bukhari, which is something called the Hadith, and the Hadith is like this collection of encyclopedias of everything Muhammad said and everything did according to topics. They're like encyclopedias. And then there's something called Sirat literature, which is biographies of Muhammad. So basically what I found out is the premise of Islam. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to give you the basic understanding of Islam as a Muslim would understand it. There's going to be plenty of things out there which challenge the standard Islamic narrative, and there's a time and a place for researching that and thinking about that. But honestly, I think what's most important is that you guys understand how a Muslim would present the narrative of Islam in a way that they feel accurately represented by it. So in Arabia in 570, there's a city called Mecca, which is the center of this polytheistic religion in Arabia. And basically the idea is all the tribes would go to Mecca to take part in something called the Hajj, this religious ritual once a year, and through that the Quraysh tribe which runs Mecca would thrive. And so Muhammad is born into this context as an orphan, and when he is about 20 years old, he marries a woman called Khadija, who is about 40, and Muhammad is already a monotheist at this time. And one day in 610, he's praying in a no. So in 595, he's praying in a cave, and he is trying to figure out which is the right religion, which is the right way right way to follow God. And a spirit appears to him, an angel appears to him, which Muslims claim is the angel Gabriel, and says, recite. And he says, I don't know how to recite. And the angel squeezes him tight, lets him go, and says, recite. And he says, I don't know how to recite. Squeezes him the second time, and this happens 3 times, and on the third time, he starts to recite the words of the Quran. So he goes back to Khadija, and he says, cover me, because I am taken by the spirit of a jinn or a poet. But Khadija says, no. What the angel said is true. You're a prophet of God. You need to listen. You need to accept this revelation. You need to teach it. So for the next few years, he starts teaching Islam to a close circle of family and friends in 610. And so in this period, the first person to believe him, other than his immediate family, so his wife Khadija, they have 4 daughters. His nephew Ali believes him. There's a wealthy merchant called Abu Bakr who believes him. There's another wealthy merchant called Uthman who believes him. And then there's some mixed reactions. So his uncle Abu Talib, who is Ali's father, really likes Muhammad and says, yeah, I don't believe what you're saying, but you're a good guy, and no one's going to hurt you while I'm alive. Right, so Abu Talib protects him. And then Abu Jahl, which means father of ignorance, it's not his real name, and then Abu Sufyan, they are the main Quraysh leaders, the tribal leaders who are opposing him. They see him as a threat to their livelihood, right? If the whole town economy depends on this idol trade, and this guy is saying there's one God and you can't make images of him, well, that's bad. Very, very, very bad for business. So they start trying to verbally oppose him, but they can't touch him because he is protected by his uncle Abu Talib, and his wife Khadija is a very prominent woman who also has the power to protect him. But and then a guy called Omar converts to Islam. But then in 619, both Khadija and Abu Talib die at the same time, around the same time. So Muhammad is left protectorless in Mecca, which means he's in serious danger at this point. So, as we said earlier, we have these camel trade routes that would come from the Hajj, and what Muhammad would do is, as they were watering their camels, he'd hang out and say, oh, did you know that there are not many gods, there is only one God, and I'm a prophet sent to tell the Arabs that there is only one God. And there's a tribe from a place called Yathrib or Medina that came down, and the Jews have told, according to the earliest Islamic sources, the Jews who were living in Medina as well were telling the Arabs that one day a prophet is going to arise, and when this prophet arises, we Jews will overthrow you Arabs. And the Medinans have the idea that if they follow the prophet before the Jews, that the Arabs will overthrow the Jews living in Medina instead. Now, whether that's historically accurate, I don't know, but that's what the earliest biography of Muhammad claims. So, the people of Medina invite Muhammad to basically come and be their supreme leader. So Muhammad and Abu Bakr in 622 make something called the Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina, and this is the start of the Islamic calendar. So the Islamic calendar starts when Muhammad gains supreme political power. In Medina, Muhammad says, I am the master of the children of Adam. This is not a boast. I am the first from whom the earth will be split on the day of judgment. This is not a boast. I am the first interceder and the first one to be granted intercession. This is not a boast. The flag of praise will be in my hand on the day of judgment. This is not a boast. So he's claiming to be the most important man who has ever lived and has supreme political authority, including over the army. So he says, whoso obeys me, obeys God. And whoso disobeys me, disobeys God. Whoso obeys the commander, obeys me. And whoso disobeys the commander, disobeys me. We also get this idea at this time, something called the Sahaba. This is the idea that the first 3 generations of Muslims are the best people who have ever lived. And everyone who's lived after them is going to be slightly more disappointing, essentially. And this is in, again, Sahih al-Bukhari, explain what that is later. Any questions so far? Yeah.
How did Muhammad hurt to Judaism, or was he just a general monotheist? Like, where did that come from? Do we know?
It never says. He never says he was Jewish. There's all sorts of theories about it, but no one really knows. But at that point, Arabia is a religious melting pot in a lot of ways. There's some Christian sects there. There's plenty of Jews there. There's, it's very close to the borders of the Roman Empire. So a lot of people with different worldviews are there. There's even like a Jewish kingdom in southern Arabia at one point. So yeah, there's any number of ways that could have happened. So when Muhammad's in Medina, he starts to build this new web of relationships. So Fatima, his daughter, marries Ali, his nephew. Then Uthman marries his daughter Ruqayya, and then Ruqayya dies, and Uthman marries another daughter, Kulthum, and then Muhammad marries the daughter of Abu Bakr called Aisha. Up until this point, Muhammad only had one wife called Khadija, but when she died, then Muhammad took multiple wives. So he also married Hafsa, the daughter of Omar. Abu Sufyan, one of his chief rivals, had a daughter called Habiba who converted to Islam. She was married to another man who converted to Islam, but then they tried to escape the persecution in Mecca by going to Ethiopia, and while they were in Ethiopia, her husband converted to Christianity, and she divorced him, and she then married Muhammad as well. And Muhammad ultimately had 9 to 13 wives, depending on the source you believe. But that was when he was in power in Medina, not previously in Mecca. So after they'd left Mecca, they'd lost all their possessions and they were now kind of destitute to some extent. So there was these camel caravans that would travel from Mecca up to Syria, to Jerusalem, to all those places and trade. And what the Medinans started doing is making raids on these camel caravans. So then the army of Mecca sends out a military expedition, and then the Muslims go and meet them at the Battle of Badr, where the Muslims with inferior forces defeat the Meccans with superior forces. The next year, there's another battle called the Battle of Uhud, and this time the Meccans win the battle, but not decisively enough. Muhammad is injured, but he is not killed. And then the next year, the Meccans come all the way to Medina, and the Medinans build a trench, and they defeat the Meccans there. And that basically breaks the military power of Mecca and makes Medina and the Muslims the rising force in the area. So from there, missionaries and armies and raiding parties are sent out all over Arabia and grows Muhammad's influence more and more. Then 8 years after he left, Muhammad turns back on Mecca and surrounds it with an army of 10,000 people and basically negotiates a peaceful surrender and everyone in the city converting to Islam. So most people surrender, about 12 people are killed, but pretty peaceful by the standards of the day. However, Muhammad died 2 years later and has not clearly delegated a successor. So this brings us to the concept of the caliphate. in Sahih Muslim says the caliphate will remain among the Quraysh, even though 2 persons are left on earth. The Quraysh is the tribe he's from. So the caliphate, so a king rules over a kingdom, a caliph rules over a caliphate. So the word caliph means successor, so this means the realm of the successor. Right. This isn't actually the throne of the caliph, by the way. This is just a neat chair I found in a mall in Dubai. Next time I go back, I want to get a picture of me sitting in it so I can put it here. So there are 3 men who claim that they are the rightful successors. There's Abu Bakr, Muhammad's best friend and father-in-law. There's Ali, his son-in-law and nephew. And then there's a guy called Sa'd ibn Ubadah, who is a tribal leader in Medina. Poor Sa'd ibn Ubadah never had a chance. So Omar and Abu Bakr go to the meeting, and Abu Bakr says, Sa'd ibn Ubadah says, one of us from Medina should rule. And Abu Bakr says, no. He says, okay, well, how about we have one ruler from Medina, one ruler from the Quraysh in Mecca? And Abu Bakr says, no. Just one ruler. I suggest, Omar or someone else. And Omar says, I will not be the leader of the community which Abu Bakr is a member. I proclaim Abu Bakr the caliph. Sa'd ibn Ubadah objects. Omar grabs him by the beard and beats him up. And Abu Bakr kind of breaks up the fight. Omar goes to Ali's house and threatens to burn it down unless he comes out and pledges allegiance to Abu Bakr. So Ali agrees, and Abu Bakr is proclaimed the caliph. So at this point, all of Arabia had been basically subdued by Muhammad, but when he died, all of the cities and tribes, except for Mecca and Medina, say, yeah, we don't want to pay your taxes, we're going to nominate our own prophets now. And they all leave Islam, and this starts an event called the Apostate Wars. So Abu Bakr wages a 2-year war as he reconquers the territory Muhammad conquered, and this all comes to a head in something called the Battle of Yamama, which I still find funny after 10 years. And this is a significant battle because at the Battle of Yamama, as we said, the Quran at this point is an oral document. It's recited, it's not written down. And it's memorized by people. And 800 people who have memorized the Quran died during the Battle of Yamama. So Abu Bakr then gathers a number of the Quran manuscripts and basically completes everything we have in the Quran today, minus 2 chapters. And then Abu Bakr wages this war against the Sassanid Empire in Persia and takes a lot of territory. Abu Bakr is old though, so 4 years after becoming caliph, he dies of old age. He's going to be the last guy to have a peaceful death in a while. But on his deathbed, he delegates Omar as the next caliph. So Omar wages this war against the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire and takes enormous amounts of territories very quickly. And again, this is only 17 years after Muhammad moved to Medina. So this is crazy rapid expansion. So, however, empires have their costs, and one of those costs was the life of Omar. 2 angry, my favorite words, Omar was assassinated by Sassanid assassins. So somebody attacked him with a poison sword while he's leading prayers. They kill the attacker, but he succumbs to the poison. And on his deathbed, Omar nominates 6 people to decide the next caliph, 2 of whom are Uthman and Ali. Remember, Uthman was also Muhammad's son-in-law with Ali. And basically how it goes is they ask Ali, what do you think? He refrains from saying anything. And they ask Uthman, what do you think? And Uthman says, I think Ali should be the caliph. Then everyone's reaction is like, wow, Uthman's so nice, let's make Uthman the caliph. I say that in a silly way, but that is actually what happened. So Uthman, though, is a very different character than Omar. And by the way, I don't expect you to remember every single detail of this. I just want to give you a feeling of, what this era is like, because it kind of gets very, very airbrushed. But all this information is coming from what I consider reliable Muslim sources. This isn't coming from skeptical scholars or anything. Is in the Islamic source material. And Uthman is a bit of a nepotist. He appoints his relatives to like government jobs, including making his cousin the governor of Damascus. And his cousin in Damascus, Omar, by contrast, the previous caliph, Omar's son got drunk publicly, and Omar gave him 80 lashes with the whip, which killed his son for being publicly drunk. Uthman's cousin, the governor of Damascus, gets drunk publicly and comes to the mosque drunk, and Uthman won't even remove him from his job. So this rebellion starts against Uthman, but before that happens, Uthman collates the Quran. So he sends this guy called Zayd to collect all the different copies of the Quran, bring them in one place, make one official state version, and then they burn the remaining manuscripts and have one centralized Quran that's distributed by the state. So based on his nepotism, Aisha, Muhammad's widow, Abu Bakr's daughter, starts a rebellion of the women in the mosque against Uthman, and then Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, Abu Bakr's other son, and a group of other men actually invade Uthman's house and stage a rebellion. It's like 600 of them, and they kill Uthman in his own home. So at this point, nobody really wants the job to be the caliph, understandably, except Ali, and Ali is appointed caliph reluctantly. And Ali is reluctant and slow to avenge Uthman's death. She's like, this is the whole mob. You find me the person who did this, and I'll kill him. But I can't point to a single person. So Aisha and Muawiyah, Aisha started this the first time, and Muawiyah, who was Uthman's cousin, Aisha starts a rebellion against Ali, and she actually rides to battle on this armored camel with a bunch of other people, but Ali eventually defeats her and surrounds the camel. Is like, Aisha, calm down. And then after this point, Aisha floats off the page of history, not really to emerge again. But then when Ali's forces are depleted, his cousin Muawiyah, Uthman's cousin Muawiyah, starts a campaign with him, and Ali's forces still have the upper hand. However, Muawiyah is very clever. Ali's a very pious man. His men are very pious. Muawiyah is not so much. So what Muawiyah does is he gets his troops to strap verses of the Quran to their armor and go into battle, and all these pious warriors won't attack the Quran, and they're all, his frontline troops are killed by Muawiyah's men. And so Ali agrees to some arbitration with Muawiyah, kind of gets a bad deal, and then basically agrees to share the caliphate with Muawiyah, as long as he doesn't appoint his sons after him. But some of Ali's own people, called the Kharijites, are so frustrated by Ali's compromise that they assassinate Ali. And this is basically the beginning of the Sunni-Shia divide. But then under the descendants of Muawiyah, the empire fractures under a guy called Marwan, and then a guy called Abdul Malik kind of reconquers it, re-centralizes the state, and then basically keeps it expanding. And from the death of Muhammad, you have basically 100 years of unchecked Muslim expansion, where they're taking over more and more of the world. And it stops at two battles. The first is the Battle of the Siege of Constantinople in 717. So basically the Muslims plan a land and sea attack, but the Byzantines deploy something called Greek fire and burn the Muslim ships and save the city of Constantinople. And that basically acts as a defensive barrier for Muslim armies going any further west. And then in 732, under Caliph Hisham, the Muslims are about trying to go from Spain, which they've taken, to France. And a guy called Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, raised a standing army and defeats the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. Now, during this time, there's a guy called Wasil ibn Atta, and he starts a school of thought called the Mu'tazilites. So the Mu'tazilites are actually a syncretist school of thought, meaning Yes, they believe the Quran, but they also believe that human reason, Greek philosophy, Indian philosophy, Egyptian philosophy, all of this should be combined together to make the best possible worldview. And then you have another, have another revolution called the Abbasid Revolution. Invite everyone to dinner and kill them. Very red wedding, and you have a new dynasty in power, a different tribe, and this is something called the Islamic Golden Age. So basically, at this time, lots of the world that wasn't previously united under one empire is suddenly in one territory, and a guy called Harun al-Rashid builds something called the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. What they do is they take literature from all around the world, translate it into Arabic, and all of a sudden, all this literature is in the same language for the first time. And out of the Islamic Golden Age, we get things like guitars, we get ice cream, we get algebra, we get advances in optics and medicine. So at this point, the Islamic world is the best place in the world to live. They have clean streets, they have street lighting, they have ice cream, they got good weather, the strongest armies, and political stability. Right? It's 166 years after Muhammad lived. It is the greatest civilization in the world at the time. Any questions on what we just went through?
When did the Quran stop? Does it stop at Muhammad's death?
Yeah.
Is there a reason that Spain is still green?
Yeah, great question. So the Abbasids took over everything except one lost Umayyad ruler managed to escape to Spain and take it over. So it remained independent of the rest of the Muslim world.
So what was the deal with the Sunnis and Shias? What was their split about?
Yeah, so basically, the Shias are the followers of Ali, and the Sunnis are the followers of the kind of community in general. So Shias represent about 10% of Muslims, Sunnis represent about 85% of Muslims.
Do they believe the same things though?
So yes and no. Like there's a lot of similar things, but what you'll see here, right, is this is where Sunni Islamic theology starts to develop. So Al-Mamun, the Caliph, and what this school, by the way, the Mu'tazilites, their belief system is different from Sunni or Shia Muslim today. There's some distinctives, but their approach to knowledge is very different. But Al-Mamun, the Caliph, is a Mu'tazilite, and he supports the Mu'tazilites as the official school of thought of the Islamic world. And there's a guy called Ibn Hanbal, who's a traditionalist Muslim, which is kind of like a proto-Sunni Muslim that believes that the Quran and everything and the life of Muhammad is the ultimate template for humanity. He is put in jail by the government at this point. There's another guy called Al-Mutawakkil, who's considered the last great caliph of the Islamic Golden Age, and he changes his mind. He decides, he agrees with Ibn Hanbal, so he releases Ibn Hanbal from jail, makes him the official school, and imprisons the Mu'tazilites and persecutes them. Ibn Hanbal has a student called Imam Bukhari, and Imam Bukhari writes a book called Sahih al-Bukhari. So over the next 80 years, 6 books of hadith are collected. And so the 6 books of hadith are basically, these are the encyclopedias of everything Muhammad said and did, categorized into topics. So what you'll find is that this is where Sunni Islam comes from, right? They mean followers of the Sunnah. So they follow the traditions handed to them by Muhammad as defined in Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and the other hadith books. And Shia, because these are passed down through word of mouth through lots of different people. And because Shia don't trust the community, there's lots of things in the hadith which Shia do not believe because they have a different method of understanding the life of Muhammad. So the Quran is the same in Sunni and Shia Islam, but a lot of the other things are different. Yeah.
So the hadith was not written down in any form until 216?
I mean, there may have been the odd writer somewhere, but no.
Okay.
And there was an earlier collection actually, about probably about 100 years before this, but most of those are not necessarily considered reliable by the average Muslims. They don't always think the early stuff is reliable. So basically, Sunni Islam develops about 280 years after the death of Muhammad, and that's when the main hadith, have finished being collected. So this is actually where we get the 5 pillars of Islam from. It comes from the hadith, not from the Quran. So Muhammad says in Sahih al-Bukhari, Islam has been built on 5 pillars. The first is the Shahada, this belief that there's only one God. You recite this in Arabic 3 times to become Muslim. There's one God and Muhammad is his messenger. You've got the daily prayers, the dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and midnight. You've got zakat, charity, which is 2.5% of your income paid to the state for charity. So if you're outside of a Muslim country, you don't pay it to the state. You figure out a way to do it privately. But it's just part of your taxes in a Muslim country. Then you have Sawm, which is fasting. So that's no eating or drinking between sunrise and sunset for the month of Ramadan. And then you have Hajj, the pilgrimage, which is every Muslim who's able must travel at least once in their life to Mecca in Saudi Arabia during the prescribed month. So there's 1 month a year you can do it. You also have the 6 pillars of faith: belief in God, belief in angels, prophets, belief in the Day of Judgment, belief in predestination, and belief in the holy books, the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran. Again, doesn't mean anybody's actually reading the Bible, and most of the, the difficulty is, right, that Muslims, because this idea of the Christian holy books are like in their imagination, they actually have to come up with some sort of answer to this. So most Muslims believe that the Bible has been corrupted over time simply because the Bible contradicts the Quran. They don't usually have any kind of, they tend to just sort of borrow secular evidence to kind of argue that. But that same secular sources would kind of challenge everything they believe as well. But often what happens is Muslims tend to be thinking about Christianity, whereas we're not really paying attention to Islam, because Islam comes 600 years after Christianity. So they have 600 years to be thinking about us when there's nothing in our source material that makes us think about them. So we have a little more work to do to be aware of Islam, whereas we're kind of living in the head of Muslims rent-free to some extent. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because as I got to know more and more Muslims, what I realized is that no one really reads the Quran to understand it. They recite it out loud to get spiritual blessings from it. But also, no one reads the Hadith either. And so I'm trying to figure out, well, why? And I think one way to understand this is you look at the sort of 6, Sitta Hadith, right? So the Quran is very manageable compared to the Bible. But when you add the 6 Sitta Hadith, right, it's a lot of information to take in. And those are just considered the most reliable ones. If you want to talk about all the Hadith that exist everywhere, whether or not people are sure they're reliable, we're going into space, right? So here's why this is important. Do you guys remember the time in the Bible where Jesus wanted water from a village in Samaria, and the village of Samaria refused to give Jesus water? And Jesus told his disciples to pick up shovels and fill the Samaritan well in with dirt. No, why didn't you guys remember that?
It's not in there.
Because it's not in there, right? And even if you never read the Bible, you could spend, it would take you how many days do you think it would take to read through all 4 Gospels? 1? Right? If you're dedicated, right? That means you can know everything that is available about the life of Jesus in a day and have a good grasp of it. However, if you're a Muslim and you're told a story about Muhammad, where there's a story where Muhammad wants to find the location of some buried treasure in a Jewish village, so he puts the Jewish treasure on his back and lights a fire on his chest until he talks. This is how much they have to search through to see if that's true. So it's this very difficult situation for the average Muslim to feel like they have any kind of grasp on the life of Muhammad in a holistic sense. So the source materials are by and large inaccessible to the average person. So what ends up happening is people rely on something called the ulama, the scholars. So the foundations for this in Islam is a hadith that says, Muhammad says, my ummah, community, will never agree upon an error. Another one says, Allah's hand is over the group, and whoever diverges from them diverges to hell. So the idea here is trust the collective. Make sure you're doing what all the other Muslims are doing. And then in another hadith, Muhammad says, scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. Right, so there's no prophets here. Who's the leader? The leaders are the scholars. So this is how... Do we have sound?
Theory, one can say that the average Muslim is not qualified to go back to the Quran and Sunnah directly and needs a tutor or needs a mentor or needs a scholar or a guide. So let me give you an example. I am not a medical doctor. So when I am sick or when a loved one is sick, what do? I don't just open up the books of medicine and then I tell the person, take this medicine, or I tell myself to take this medicine. I go to somebody who has trained in the sciences, who has trained in medicine, and then I ask their advice. Similarly, the one who does not have an Islamic training, he or she must go to a scholar. And that scholar is therefore considered to be trustworthy in these issues.
So, you see how he's talking about this? You, the average Muslim, are not qualified to understand the Islamic source materials. So how does that play out? So this is Hafsa. Hafsa lives here in Seattle. She's nice. She's not a real, I made her up, she's a cartoon, right? She's not a real person, she's an archetype. And this orange ring around her head represents her worldview. And her worldview is made up of a few things. It's made up of the Islamic sources, the Quran, the Hadith. It's made up of things from Muslim culture. It's made up of things from foreign culture, and it's made up of her conscience because she is an image bearer of God, but not directly. So these are Hafsa's parents. Hafsa's parents are also nice, and then we've got this like larger section of people around her. So we've got both sets of grandparents. We've got the imam of the local mosque. Hafsa doesn't really talk to him that much. Maybe like once a year at Ramadan. He says, Hafsa, how are your grades? And she says, oh, they're good, mashallah. And that's about the extent of the interactions they have. She has her pretty seriously Muslim aunt, and then she's got her slightly more feminist aunt. And then we have crazy Uncle Hafiz. Crazy Uncle Hafiz is a bit of a weirdo and has some kind of outlandish opinions. However, he makes like amazing kebabs. So people kind of keep him around for that reason. And then, you've got this wider web of people, teachers, other relatives, the sheikh that the imam kind of gets his information from. She's seen her dad talk to the sheikh one time, but she's never talked to the sheikh. And then you've got, scholars who are actually in the source materials. You've got people who are more connected to the culture, more connected to foreign culture, and everybody's connected to their conscience because, again, every one of these people is an image bearer of God. Every one of these people is a sinner too, and they have a sin nature. And Hafsa is going to find things from the Islamic sources. Some of them are going to be inspirational and fake, meaning it's a story that makes her feel good. It's not an authentic story, like a story where Muhammad has a Jewish neighbor, and Muhammad's Jewish neighbor hates him, but Muhammad takes him a meal every day. Not a true story, but people repeat it. An inspirational story, maybe that Muhammad took Mecca more or less bloodlessly, and people are inspired by that kind of wisdom, and that's an authentic story, right? Then there's going to be some things that are non-inspirational and authentic. Boring details about Muhammad's life, and there's going to be some things that are troubling and authentic. So something that's inspirational and authentic, right, is found in the Islamic sources, in the Hadith or the Quran. So Muslim scholars look through the Islamic sources, and they have a filter of proper Hadith science, meaning they're trying to accurately trace the historical legacy of a certain story and look how many sources it has, at what time it appears, and try and do that accurately. And they filter out the things that don't have those reliable historical paper trails, basically. Then those get passed to other scholars, and then gets passed to people in the community. And this guy has a filter of Islam according to the scholars. whatever the scholars believe, I believe. Whatever the scholars reject, I reject. So he's going to look pretty similar to the type of Islam the scholars practice. Takes it pretty seriously, and that kind of like goes out into the community, and it comes to Hafsa through lots of different people. Right? Now, something that's inauthentic comes out of Muslim culture, like that story about Muhammad being nice to his Jewish neighbor, and that goes out to other people. And this guy has a filter of Islam according to the Ummah. I look at the people around me, and I kind of agree with whatever they're doing. And all my neighbors, my Muslim friends, they're hospitable people. Taking food to a Jewish neighbor sounds like something they would do. This story makes me feel good. It's true. So he filters out the bad stuff and then puts those positive stories out there. And it fans out into the community and spreads and comes to Hafsa in exactly the same way that the authentic stuff does. She hears everything from just this web of people. So then, something that's boring kind of comes the same way, and then take something that's troubling and authentic, right? So one instance of this is Muhammad has a sermon in the mosque, and he says, give charity, women, because I looked and I saw that in the fires of hell there were more women than men. And I'm like, why? It's like, because you're ungrateful. Anyway, so that's really in the source material, right? And this scholar reads this story, and he filters out the inauthentic stuff. But when he reads this story, he's like, this says that women are less pious than men. But if I look at the community I'm in, that doesn't really feel right or true. I'm just going to keep reading. And because it troubles his soul, he ignores it and keeps reading. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't argue against it. He's just like, oh, never mind, next thing. And so this other scholar doesn't have the problem, and so it does spread a little bit. And then it goes to the sheikh, who has the same reaction as this guy. And then it goes to Crazy Uncle Hafiz. And Crazy Uncle Hafiz says, Hafsa, guess what? There's more women in hell than men. So you'll be thankful next time I make you kebabs. Now, so Hafsa hears it, like she's not completely unaware of it. It doesn't feel as authentic as the rest of it, right? Islam feels like the good stuff she's received, not the danger, not like the hard stuff. So this is a problem you have in the Muslim world. So take Afghanistan right now. You have different people drawing different things from the Islamic source material, and they bring wildly different ways of living out of it. And they look at each other and the way they live their life, and they're going to say, that's not real Islam. But the problem is, the only appeal they have is, well, our scholars say that you're wrong. No, our scholars say that you're wrong. Well, those aren't the real scholars. And this is the problem that you have, because the source material is so vast that nobody can really get through it all. And even if you could, you're just living in this idea that you're told you're not qualified to understand this. You're just sort of stuck. So Hafsa then, in the mix of this, is getting all these different ideas from all these different places, and she has a filter which says Muhammad is the best of creation. But her definition of what best is not defined by pure Islamic version of best. It's defined by all these other inputs she has. Is a little bit Islam, a little bit Marvel Cinematic Universe, a little bit Turkish soap operas. Like, her idea of good is defined by herself. So she filters out the things she thinks are bad and lets through the things she thinks are good. And then she creates her own version of Muhammad, who looks like this, right? Nice guy, but this isn't a real historical figure. This is an amalgamation, a combination of all the good things about all the Muslims she knows and loves. He's just this kind of imaginary archetype. When you compare him to history's Muhammad is a much more complicated character. But the problem is, when we come at this from the Protestant worldview, we want to go to the sources and we want to critique this guy straight away. The problem is, because Hafsa is not aware that Muhammad's like this, it feels like an attack on this guy. and therefore an attack on these people, these people, these people, and these people, right? It's just it feels an attack on Islam does not feel like an attack of a set of ideas. It feels like an attack on all these people she knows and loves. So what we so what I'm suggesting here is understanding what the real authority in Hafsa's life is. Is the ultimate authority in her life the Quran? No. It's this loose collection of people. People are her authority. And that's actually a much easier thing to talk about than it is to talk about the Quran, right? So if we're honest as Christians, what do we think Muhammad is?
False prophet.
A false prophet, right? There's no other conclusion. Are her parents false prophets? No. They are image bearers of God, and they are sinners. Which means all the best things about reality and all the worst are contained within them. She knows that already. Right? Same with the rest of the Muslim community. But the problem is, this is where she gets all of her information from. So, what Islam, what the premise of Islam is the main authority, the foundational authority is supposed to be the Quran, then the Sunnah, which includes the Hadith, then the scholars, and then the Ummah. In reality, for the average Muslim, the authority actually goes Ummah as the foundation, and then the scholars, then the Sunnah, and then the Quran way up there, which everyone believes implicitly and doesn't really read and study. So, when we want to talk about things like, okay, the Quran calls Jesus the Messiah, then Hafs is going to be like, oh, that's interesting, you should go talk to my imam about that. I'm not a scholar, I can't understand it. The Quran affirms the Bible. Oh, that's very interesting. One day, when I'm retired and go and read the Quran properly, maybe I'll have time to get to the Bible after that one day. Once you get a little closer, once you get to the Sunnah, well, the Islamic source materials are detrimental to women. It's like, okay, well, my dad's not detrimental to women. Maybe Uncle Hafiz is, but most of the men in the community are fine. Okay, well, there are terrorists doing things in the name of Islam, and they're using the Islamic source to justify that. Okay, well, none of my friends and family are terrorists, except maybe Hafiz. But he's harmless, he's just a cranky old man, right? Once you start to get to the leadership level, no one in the Muslim world can stop the terrorists. That starts to hit a little bit more of a nerve. Or, Muslim countries have corrupt government. Those things tend to have, hit more of a nerve. But when you really start to kind of like hit a nerve and actually have like reasonable interactions is when you start to get to the community level. Why does everyone gossip? Why are people so judgmental? How do I keep my own culture and fit in with the world? Why can't I talk to anyone about mental health? How can I know if I've done enough? I can't be myself. And how can I know who is telling the truth? So, Hafsa hears from Uncle Hafiz and her seriously Muslim aunt that Prophet Muhammad is the best of creation. And she says, yes, I believe you. She also hears, you must enter the bathroom with your left foot first. And she thinks, what? That's stupid. I'm not going to do that. Right? So some things she believes them, some things she does not. Then they tell her, the Bible has been changed by the Christians and the Jews. She doesn't automatically believe everything they tell her. Why should she believe this? Right? She believes it because it's convenient for her to believe it. So I was on a flight from Istanbul to LAX one time. And I sat next to this Palestinian woman. And I asked her, so you're Muslim, where do you get your information about Islam from? And she says, I'm having a hard time with this right now because all of the scholars are on the payroll of some government somewhere, and I don't trust the governments to pay them, so why would I trust the scholars? So, interesting point. Later on in the flight, she said, okay, here's a question. I'm Palestinian, you're Christian, what do you think about Israel and Palestine? I said, great question. So God chose Abraham to be a blessing to all the nations of the world, all the nations, all the tribes, all the families. So God choosing Israel was never about excluding people. It was about saving the world. It's because God loves the world and God wants to bring good news to the nations. And Israel being God's chosen people was never an excuse to treat people badly. It was always a mandate to treat them well. But the main reason it was there was actually to bring about Jesus the Messiah, who would die as a sacrifice for the whole world. And went through Isaiah where it says he'd sprinkled all the nations in his blood. And I explained to her that Jesus claimed to be this Messiah. He died and rose from the dead. So if she trusts in him, all the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can belong to her too. And she said, that's really interesting, but I've been told the Bible was corrupt. I said, who told you that? She said, the scholars. I said, the same scholars you don't trust? Do you trust them when they tell them the Bible's corrupt? She says, I don't know. So again, people believe the Quran implicitly and never read it. But the real authority in their life is people, right? And by kind of like dealing with this issue, we're dealing with the issues people are actually dealing with. And the Bible answers this very directly. So Matthew 23, Jesus says, you're not to be called rabbi, teacher, for you have one teacher, and you're all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. Meaning that every individual Christian is expected to understand God directly, not through intermediaries. So Hafsa becomes a Christian, and she now has to figure out how to navigate these things. So she still has influences, right? She has scripture, she has culture, and she has conscience. So she has this new web of people. She has her Muslim family. She has a Christian friend from college. She has her Christian friend's parents, the elders of the local church, and like a seminary guy all the elders read. But notice she now has a direct line to Scripture. So she's going to deal with things that are good from culture, bad from culture. She's going to deal with false religion, and she's going to deal with biblical Christianity. And these things will come from different places. There'll be good things from her family, bad things from her family, and there'll even be some false religion from an elder in a church at one point. But she now has a filter which says, all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, training, and righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. Meaning that she now has the filter she needs to be able to look at all of this and filter out the things that do not align with Scripture, and she is able to create her own view of God from the Scripture, which isn't complete by any means, but when you compare it to God's self-revelation, it is nevertheless authentic. And as she grows in reading the Scriptures and understanding God, her view of God will align more and more with God's self-revelation, informed by the Scriptures with the cross at the center. That's what I got for you guys. Any thoughts, questions? Yes.
So you talked about the Sunni-Shia split, but where does Wahhabism fit into that historical narrative?
Okay, so Wahhabism is a branch of Sunni Islam, which is from a guy called Muhammad Abdul Wahhab in Saudi Arabia in like the 1700s. It's a basically. So remember Ibn Hanbal, who got put in jail? He was one of the Islamic schools of thought called Hanbalism, and Wahhabism is basically a subset of Hanbali Islam, which is basically going back to the Quran and the Hadith as directly as possible. The Sahaba are the best 3 generations of people that ever exist, and is a kind of uniquely Saudi version of that. Outside of Saudi Arabia, it'd be referred to as like Salafism. So sometimes those are used interchangeably. So it's the idea that strictly following the way of life of the companions is, and kind of ignoring a lot of later scholars and jurisprudence is the most important thing to do. And the other school of thoughts just kind of have lots of mitigating scholars in between.
So you mentioned in there how important the community is, and that it can very easily feel like we're attacking people that they know. So how do you mitigate against that? Like, how do you know how to be able to challenge without seeming like you're attacking?
So I think the best thing to do, what you need to do is ask lots of good questions and listen well. Like, don't go into a conversation assuming you know what they believe, even if you know a lot about Islam. Draw the person out, figure out, what they believe. Ask kind of questions as much as you can. And, what you want to try and do is figure out the problems that they themselves observe and help deal with those from the scripture. And I think usually if you just kind of like listen well and take the person seriously as an individual, most of that kind of gets mitigated. But also, one thing that can help a lot is by making kind of qualifying statements, right? So it's like, I know some Muslims believe this. Like, what do you think of this? Right? So I know some Muslims don't believe that Jesus was crucified. What do you think? So, stuff like that. Just make sure you build in like caveats and nuances, so they don't feel the need to defend people. Like, there's people in the Muslim community who believe this, rather than Islam teaches this, is kind of useful wording for that. On a couple of levels. One, it kind of gets them off the hook from having to defend Islam, and also you're pointing more directly at the actual authority at this point, right? You're not saying, and it's like, and so what you're trying to get to the point of is figuring out, okay, well, how do you know what you know? Where is your information coming from? Why do you trust that source of information? Have you, and what we're really trying to do is just kind of get people to go deeper in this, and just think more deeply about why they believe what they believe, and why we believe, and getting to kind of consider what we believe, and just try and make it as low pressure as possible. Any more thoughts, questions, observations?
Question. When you're having a conversation with someone who believes in Islam, is there what sort of like terminology is important to be careful around? Like, for instance, saying that someone believes in Muslim or something, like issues that could come up where you like say the wrong thing and it immediately comes off as disrespectful.
I wouldn't worry about it too much. I'd just be, friendly and honest, and the more questions you ask, the better it is, right? So if you mix up Islam and Muslim, you just be, hey, I'm sorry, can you remind me what the difference between Islam and Muslim is? And they'll be happy to explain it. If you're not sure, ask questions. So I honestly don't think it's all that complicated. Just be, friendly, honest, and listen well, and you'll be fine. Where you want to be careful is when you're communicating what you believe, that you're prepared to like make sure you're clarifying what you're saying, right? So, for example, if we use the term Son of God, what they think we mean by that is God slept with Mary and produced a demigod. That's what most Muslims think we mean when we say Jesus is the Son of God. So if you're going to use the term Son of God, which you should because it's biblical, clarify that. When I say Jesus is the Son of God, I don't mean that God and Mary hooked up and produced a half God. I mean Jesus eternally existed and then entered into creation through Mary.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there some other common misconceptions like that in terms of terminology, like that Son of God example you just mentioned?
Other common misconceptions. I think there's plenty of misconceptions. I think one of them would be that Christianity is like morally loose because they kind of conflate Christianity with the West a lot of the time. I think if somebody grew up here, they're less likely to think that, but often if someone's from like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or from other Muslim countries, that they are likely to kind of conflate Christianity in the West, or Christianity and Catholicism, or whatever it is. It's like there's going to be lots of things that are easily conflated. So just making sure you're taking the time to say, hey, I use this word. What do you think when you hear that word? What does that mean to you?
Do these kind of questions help when you're talking to someone who's like culturally Muslim but not necessarily a practicing Muslim?
Yes, a great deal, because this is this is really, because the thing with Muslim culture, right, is they believe the people who are cultural Muslims are still real Muslims. So the reason for that is, in Islam, hell is more like purgatory for the Muslim than hell in Christianity. Meaning that they believe as long as somebody's like genuinely a Muslim and hasn't renounced it, they will eventually get to paradise. Which means if somebody lives a sort of mediocre life, they'll go to hell for a bit and then go to paradise eventually. So what that means is sin for the Muslim functions like credit card debt. So what you'll find from most cultural Muslims is there's a sense of, I feel like I should be more religious one day, but I don't want to right now in fear of sacrificing my individuality. So oftentimes cultural Muslims are a mix of hungry for answers, but also like trying to avoid thinking about religion because it kind of makes them feel guilty for what they're not doing right now. But all these things are perhaps more relevant to the cultural Muslim than the practicing Muslim.
Does the West tend to be more cultural Muslims than practicing, or is it a mix?
I'd say it's a pretty strong mix. But actually, I think in the West, even cultural Muslims feel more obliged to defend Islam if they feel like it's being attacked. Like, I know lots of people who will defend Islam and defend the logic of it, who are actually agnostic privately, but publicly they feel like they have to defend Islam because they feel like they're defending their society and family and culture, and they feel like that's under attack. So the more, once you get to know people, all the things you criticize about Islam, Muslims criticize about Islam as well, once you get to know people. But if they hear you do it, they're like, no, you don't understand Islam. It's beautiful, it's peaceful, it's everything. It's, so getting through that barrier is really, really helpful.
I feel like from the Christian perspective, it's really the same thing. If someone comes in and just tries to start like lambasting Christianity, every Christian's just kind of like, hey, no, this is amazing for society. But then on the inside, most Christians are also critical of the same things within Christianity that everyone from the outside sees and are like, hey, that's kind of not really a good thing. So it's just like the flipped situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we going to get into like differences in views of like how we are saved and what sin is next time, or is that?
Are we doing that? Are we doing this next week, or a future date, or?
If that still works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, we will. Next week we'll go through the sort of specific key worldview differences. Yes.
Back to the history. How was it really that easy for like Muhammad to kind of be the supreme emperor of Medina?
Yeah, it was. Like they basically invited him to become that.
Why did they want him to? That kind of like that doesn't really make sense to me. It's like
It doesn't really make sense to me either. But but part of it is because the city is like half Arab and half Jewish, and they see him as somebody who can potentially like fix that situation because he's a monotheist like the Jews and he's Arab like the Arabs, so they sort of see him as a kind of good middleman. So yeah, the story is that they heard there was a prophet coming, and they pledged allegiance to him, and after they pledged allegiance to him, he went back to them the next day and they said, God has revealed to me that you cannot just follow me spiritually, you have to make me your commander as well. And they agreed to those terms, and that's how he got the job, basically. according to the earliest source. Yes.
Why does the calendar start with him going to Medina?
Well, basically, what that shows you is how central the state is in Islamic history. So it's become less so in the last 100 years because there has not been a caliph for 100 years at this point. But like Islam really defines itself in Medina. So like going to the mosque, for example, and praying in the mosque on a Friday comes from Medina. Zakat, the tax, comes from Medina. So these things are like established in Medina. So that's kind of how Islam takes shape. So if you're in a mosque in like 700 AD or 750 AD, the sermon on Friday would start with, "In the name of God, in the name of Muhammad, in the name of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, here's the sermon." And as power decentralizes, it would be like, "In the name of God, in the name of Muhammad, in the name of the Caliph, in the name of the local Sultan." So they'd always start their sermons by naming their political rulers. Like, that'd be like going to church on a Sunday and the pastor getting up and saying, "In the name of Pope Francis, in the name of Joe Biden, I deliver this message of God to you," right? Like, and that was the norm in the Islamic world until 100 years ago. Some Islamic schools of thought didn't even believe it was permissible to gather as Muslims in a non-Muslim country because Jummah prayer is a prerogative of the Sultan. Almost no one believes that now, but that is how it was in history. Does that answer your question of why the Hijrah is so important? I mean, just if anything, it's like it just shows you what they valued, right? And so the calendar is created by the state, and the most important thing to the state is when the state was created.
I noticed that the name for the pilgrimage to Mecca is the Hajj, which is the same name as what you were describing as the idol trade and worship thing in Mecca pre-Muhammad. So is that thought to be Muhammad taking the name from that, or something different?
Basically, what Muslims believe is that the Kaaba, where people make pilgrimage to, the Hajj, was built by Abraham and Ishmael, and then the polytheists appropriated and corrupted it, and Muhammad was like taking it back to what it originally was.
So it's like the name of the original Abraham thing was the Hajj, and then it was
That's what
changed,
they believe. Yeah.
You said when the Quran was being, well, it was memorized, and then 800 people died who had it memorized, and then the one guy who was collecting, you said collecting the manuscripts, but you said that it hadn't been written down yet. So were those just pieces of surahs, and they were kind of gathered, and then...
Yeah, there were pieces, so it was a collection of written documents in fragments, and people would memorize it as well. So they kind of get a couple guys to memorize it together and kind of compare them, and there were fragments of it. And then at the time of Uthman, there had been a little bit more written down, and kind of a couple of different collectors of this, but they were making one official collection. Yeah.
Is there any difference between what they believe about like Old Testament stories and what we believe?
Yes, lots of differences actually. So basically what seems to be happening in the Quran is that, so between the Old Testament and the New Testament and the time of Islam, a lot of folk tales from like the Talmud and the Midrash come about in the world. And the Quran really seems to be referencing those as much as it's referencing the Old or the New Testament as well. And what you'll find in the Quran is it tends to like blend these stories together. So for example, the story of Joshua, the story of Gideon, the story of Saul, and the story of David and Goliath are all basically combined into one like mega narrative, where King Saul consults the Ark of the Covenant, goes to the river with his army, and God says, "All right, people, you're right. Everyone who drinks like a dog, go over with me to fight Goliath." And then David is one of those 300 men that Saul picks, and David kills Goliath. Right. So it's combined Joshua with the Ark of the Covenant, Gideon, Saul, and David into one sort of like mega narrative, basically. So it reads like a book, which is dealing with folklore. So you have like one example of this is in Jewish folklore that God actually like levitates Mount Sinai off the ground, has them like walk under it and look up at the base, has them walk back out and puts it down again, and that story is in the Quran as well. So a lot of the sort of like differences are traceable to Jewish folklore and Christian folklore.
So do they print their own like Old Testaments?
No.
No.
No, it just references the occasional story in the Quran, basically.
Oh, so they're just Quran like quoting.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that Uthman burned the non-official versions of the Quran. Did any of those survive?
Maybe.
Maybe.
So there is a manuscript called the sort of Sa'ana palimpsest manuscript which was found in the Grand Sa'ana Mosque in Sa'ana in Yemen, and there's a palimpsest reading on that. And a palimpsest is basically you can scan it and look at what was written on the manuscript before it was like washed off and written new, and so that Quran has like slightly different readings in a few places, not massively different, but there's some evidence of what it has. Probably nothing major, just kind of a couple of. Some people believe there should be 2 less chapters. Some people believe there are 2 more chapters. Probably wasn't anything like massively different, but that's the basic spirit of it. Cool. We good? I'll hang out for a bit if anyone has any extra questions, but yeah.